And the military has been looking at intuition for many decades, and it was made fun of in a movie called Men Who Stare at Goats.
Yes. I wanted to talk to you about this.
Even though it was made fun of in that movie and that particular research program was closed, it has been opened again. I know this because I spoke to a military scientist. It's top secret. Like, no one on the actual team talked to me, but I know the military scientist who's saying this is going on because my colleagues are all doing it, but they won't talk to me either. There were so many soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan who had expressed that, they had saved their life or someone else's life because they just felt like, I just shouldn't go down that road. And what do you call that? What the research showed is that the soldiers were always more than 50% accurate when doing these sort of intuition exercises, showing that it was more than chance.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. It is fun, in a brain uppercutting sort of way, to occasionally reflect on the fact that we just kind of make up mouth noises as placeholders for some of life's biggest mysteries. And I guess we really have to, because these are things that are elusive. These are qualities that have to be experienced. They can't be captured by empirical measurement. And in case it's not clear, the sort of things I'm talking about: love, happiness, the aforementioned intuition. And let's use that as an illustrative example. Intuition is just a placeholder word that we use when we have a gut feeling, or sense something, or have a strong, unexplainable impulse to do something or not do something. But once again, intuition is just a mouth noise that we paste over the top of a huge mystery. I think it's probably clear if you watch this show, but I don't mean to suggest by pointing this out that these phenomena, these subjective experiences, are any less important or any less real, just that they are fundamentally mysterious. We don't understand what they really are. We just kind of find ourselves in these states. So at best, we can learn to identify them, or maybe learn how to work with them, flow with them, evoke them. And you know what else is fun? Finding someone with some of the most impressive academic credentials imaginable that agrees with you. And that is precisely the sort of someone that Dr. Emma Seppala is. She's a Stanford-educated research psychologist who lectures at Yale. Her work has been published in top academic journals. She's highly respected in her field, but she's also incredibly interested in these big philosophical questions. Questions about consciousness, intuition, the psyche, various other fare beyond the scope of the scientific method, at least for now. She's also the best-selling author of The Happiness Track and her latest book, Sovereign. In this one, we riff not just on intuition, but so much more: breathwork, meditation, trauma, and why it often cannot be reached, truly addressed by just thinking about it or talking about it. But with that, my friends, all of the links that you will need for the wise, kind Dr. Emma Seppala are in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops. And on the note of this show, my friends, do us a favor, tickle that algorithm with a like, a sub, a comment, a share. That algorithmic daimon must be fed. We've also got a pretty massive back catalog of audio-only mind melds with really brilliant beings. You can only hear those on podcast platforms like Apple Pods, Spotify, so do subscribe to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you would like to riff with me, if you would like to really initiate yourself into our Wonder Lodge and support the show more directly, head over to patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. We are riffing in said community every day via our patron-only Discord server, in our book club, in our Wonder Gym hangs on Zoom. You can get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more, all at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. I would love to riff with you there. And with that, one more thing of note, I suppose. We did have to record this one in 2 chunks, as you will likely notice, due to the outfit changes and such. Emma's time was really limited. Big thanks to her for making this happen. That said, I do think it flowed together rather unbumpily, to use the technical term. So I hope you dig it, my friends. And with that, let's meld minds with the lovely, wise Dr. Emma Seppala. I was just going to say, I can tell you've got such a deep well of wisdom. And I'm really excited to get into many angles of that wisdom in however abbreviated of an amount of time we have. But first, thank you. And two, very excited to riff with you.
I'm so delighted to be here too, Michael.
So I mentioned I was gonna throw something your way um, right at the jump here, and it's something that I had not heard of before, but now I'm immediately going to look into it. And I may have written this down wrong because I was on a walk when I heard you mention it. But the
Hmm.
yoga vashishta, is that correct?
Yeah.
Tell me about the yoga vashishta because I am obsessed with any of these like sources of ancient wisdom that posit a sort of, illusory reality. And this is one I had not heard of. So I figured you said it made such an impact on you that you keep it by your bedside. So I knew I had to ask.
Well, you know, movies like Inception or The Matrix point to this sort of idea of this reality within a reality within a reality and what's real, what's
Right.
not. And actually, according to Buddhist scholar Bob Thurman, professor emeritus at Columbia, he says the Matrix was actually based off of the Yoga Vashishta.
Hmm.
And it's when you read it, I just think of it as it sort of deprograms you. When you are reading this story that's within a story within a story going into a story, and your mind it just it feels mind boggling. But then what happens when you read it is you come back, when you're in the real world, quote unquote real world, you just start to gain a little distance from events and happenings, and realize, I mean, we are living on this planet. We are, as as far as the universe, we're as tiny as an ant, minuscule,
Right.
meaningless in terms of our size, in terms of the time that we're here on this planet. It's nothing compared to time, right? Eternal. And uh, a scope of history of the planet even. And so it just sort of puts that perspective in, but it does so through reading these stories within stories where you're like, oh, that's right. And each one of us is living in our own little universe with me, myself, and I in the middle, and that nobody else has any idea about it. It's just
Yeah.
really funny. And it's also so fascinating to me that we love watching movies and listening to stories, and we are like, just like little kids that way. And we're sitting and entertaining ourselves looking at someone else's story on social media, whatever it is, right? Our minds are always in stories, and yet
Yeah.
what the Yoga Vashishta does is sort of help deprogram you, and so that when you are in your little reality, you start to see things from a broader perspective. uh,
Yeah.
Helps
Yeah.
you get out of the stickiness of things you can get stuck in, in your life.
I'd love to hear a little bit more about the specific contents. Is this part of a larger text?
Let me see if I have it here. Do you want me to go get it?
Yeah, sure.
Show
If it's
you. Hold
on.
on a second. It's a pretty big book.
Oh wow.
It's got thousands of pages, and it is said that if you read this cover to cover 3 times, you can become enlightened.
Ooh, I like
Sounds
that. I
good,
like
right?
that chat. That's
Done
quite
that
a
yet?
yeah. You should have used that on your books promo tour. Um, but yeah. So I have a love-hate relationship with these Matrix style stories. Like I just recently did a pretty big deep dive into Plato's Cave, which is like,
I love that.
another one of these ancient stories that is
Yeah.
essentially
Yes.
highlighting the fact that we're living in this lower dimensional sliver of reality, if not an
Yeah.
outright false reality.
Yes.
And I think that's indisputable. I mean, your point about how we're living in this like Russian doll of stories, right? A story within a story within a story within a story, and then we're jumping mentally from story to story to story. It's so true, but then that gives us this propensity to want to latch on to stories that we like, right? We can take these stories about living in a false reality and take them in a really helpful direction or a really harmful direction where we can tell ourselves, for instance, some version of the like all the cliche new age platitudes, right? That just by like changing something in our mind we can change reality, or just by um making some like there's some hack, there's some secret, there's some little just magic practice you need to do, and then suddenly that's going to snap you out of the quote unquote matrix, and you'll have some kind of awakening that will elevate you. Or there's a way to kind of paradoxically sink deeper into what is real through the acknowledgement of all the constructs that you're surrounded by. And then that sort of releases you into what you talk so beautifully about in terms of sovereignty, right? Like you regain this sense of personal sovereignty by acknowledging the stories that are captivating you or keeping you asleep or keeping you on autopilot. Um, and I wonder, how do you discern between the two? Like the helpful stories that will actually do that for you versus just keep you in delusion.
We have to be grounded in this reality, right? In this, in the everyday, what's going on. We have to be there and we have to participate. And we want to show up as our best selves for that. And in order to do that, being able to gain perspective and have some wisdom about, the finiteness of life, for example, allows you to perhaps give people a little grace, give yourself a little grace,
Yeah.
act with a little more love and compassion, a little more patience, a little more tolerance, and perhaps not taking everything quite so seriously. That's, I think, what perspective and wisdom can do. And reading these kinds of deeper wisdom texts can help you just have that perspective, because it is really hard for us. We do get
Hmm.
sucked in, and we will get sucked in by things like grief and pain, and that's just the reality of it. You can have all the wisdom in the world and you may still have tears running down your face, right?
Right.
But what it can help us with is, during those few years that we are on this planet, how can we show up at our best while also enjoying the beauty that this world has to offer, along with its challenges. And so I think if wisdom can help us do that, then that's really helpful. Um, and part
Yeah.
of that is, yeah, gaining that perspective.
Yeah. And so in this story, in this Vashisha story, I promise we won't talk about this the whole time, but I'm just curious about it because I'm hearing about it for the first time. Is there like a narrative presented in the same way as like like a Bhagavad Gita type mythological narrative, or what is? Yeah, can you tell me more about that if you remember?
If I remember correctly, but there is I do believe it starts off with the prince looking for, he's has got some big questions.
Mhm.
Young man has some big questions, and then there's a sage, Vashishta, who is gathering people, and he's going to be teaching on this. And as he does so, there's all sorts of things happening, and a bird and a
Yeah.
tree and a this and a that, and it keeps going into these other stories and then coming back and going back out, coming back. In a way, now I think about it, it's kind of the analogy of our mind, right? Our mind
Right.
is like, it's here having dinner, and then it's going off and that's coming back, and then wandering off and back, and then thinking about what this person said, and all this stuff. But anyway, the way that the book is I feel like it, like, if our mind is a big like a big mess of cords with lots of
Mhm.
knots, it's pulling that, how you pull the cords apart to try and
Yeah.
disentangle
Yeah.
it in that way. What I find so interesting about some of these Vedic approaches is that they are not linear. And we're so used to the linear, right? How do I get from A to B, right? But the Vedic approach is very nonlinear. And my personal spiritual teacher, Gurudev Sri Ravi Shankar, who I've been studying meditation with for 20 years, when I hear him talking, he shares his wisdom, but it's also not linear.
Yeah.
And I think that in that way, it gets us out of the mind. We get so stuck in the rational, and rationality is a beautiful thing, of course, but we can get so stuck there that we can't see beyond. And so sometimes these wise elders, when they speak, it actually starts to disentangle our rigid way of thinking and seeing things through this different approach. And we need a different approach in these times. I think we live in a time when we worship at the pillar of religion, right? We worship at the pillar of rationality and reason
Right.
as
Right.
religion, science as religion, and logic as religion. And of course, it's great to be a logical thinker, no doubt, but it can keep us. And I think Gurdjieff says, as he says, logic will take you into the garage, but it won't take you into the living room, you know,
Mm.
because you can't. There's an experience that's beyond just the rational mind, and I think some ways our planet, because it's been so stuck in the rational and has gotten away from the heart too, has gotten away from the compassion, right? And so And yet we can, yeah. So it's just interesting to think about these things.
Absolutely. And speaking of that, this is something that I find to be in common with a lot of the people who come through the institutions that are supposed to give knowledge, wisdom, direction at the highest level. This is you're another example of this. The guy I just had on most recently, Dr. Tom Cheatham. He was a biologist for years, and still had this sort of like nebulous thirst for something more, and then that led him down this whole path of interest into like mysticism, depth psychology. And it seems like, and let me also sidebar and say, I do not want to diminish or admonish those institutions at all. I think it's incredibly important to have a rigorous academic background. I highly value I have a journalism background, and in so many ways that taught me how to think, how to analyze information, how to, you know, um, just critically question sources of what I'm reading, why people wrote what they wrote. All of those things are so important. But
Yeah.
then at the end of the day, it's like you can take that rigorous empirical chopping, weighing, dividing approach to its maximum. And then in my experience, and seemingly in the experience of so many people like you, there's still this something else that is not fed by that. And it's in the book, you talk about how you had this sort of post college um you know threshold guardian, to use like the mythopoetic terminology of like when you just encounter something that puts you in this real state of soul searching and uncertainty and almost depression. And if I remember correctly, that's what kind of led you into doing meditation, reading these Vedic texts, looking for a teacher. Can you tell me about that period in your life?
Yeah, I went to an elite college. I went to Yale, and when I got there, and it just felt like everybody's goal was to become number one.
Yeah.
And the training and education was good, obviously, but there's a sense of elitism, and that the elite are the people who achieve the most, right? And I always just thought, really? That's what an elite person is someone who was fortunate enough to have enough books in their house to read and to make it to one of these institutions? Is that what elitism is? Because I always just felt like the elite are the ones who are making a difference on this planet. They're the ones who are helping others. Like that, to me, those are the people that I looked up to. But and so I was thirsting in college. I thought there must be something else. There was no discussion of even values, of even, kindness or service, none of that.
Right.
And I thought this just felt so empty, right? Um, and so after college, I went to China. So in China, I was in communist China. It was also completely devoid of spirituality and very, very materialistic, at least when I was there, 99 to 2001. People were just starting to get more money, and they were like super happy to like have a running toilet in their apartment. That was the height of luxury, and they were shopping and all this stuff.
Yeah.
And part of me was just amazed by China's incredible place, but at the same time, I was thirsting. I was like, God, even here, it's like a height of materialism. Like, there's got to be something more. And then I went to Tibet, and I saw these little old ladies prostrating in the mud after having traveled on the top of a bus for like 6 days from their little pig farm on the other side of Tibet just to be in Lhasa once in their life, and smuggling pictures of the Dalai Lama into their wallets and
Mm,
overcoats, and showing me that you cannot suppress the human spirit. It will do what it wants. It will worship who it wants. And I remember just seeing those little old ladies in the mud and thinking, this is what devotion is.
yeah.
I'd heard that word. I'd never understood what it meant. And it really touched my heart because this is so profound. It was such a profound experience to see that power of the human spirit, who, despite a lot of dangers, continues to be sovereign to its belief systems. And I also lived in an apartment with a elderly Chinese gentleman who was my friend's father. And I think he was enlightened. I mean, he was the
Wow.
happiest person I'd ever met. And he had been through the Cultural Revolution as a professor, meaning he'd been sent to the countryside. There'd been mass starvation. He lost his wife. I mean, things had been hard. And yet he was the happiest person I'd ever seen. He was always smiling. He's genius inventor who was constantly inventing things that are now currently being used here in the US.
Wow.
Anyway, and he was free. I felt he was free despite everything that happened to him. He had freed himself. And I thought, wow, like, what is it that they have? These people have. They have something, and it's really special. And that's why I went back to New York City to do a master's in East Asian studies, Buddhist studies with Robert Thurman and others. And that's also when 9/11 happened. So it was just kind of a
Mm.
crazy time to be in Manhattan. And I had this longing to, when I walked into Robert Thurman's class, I was like, oh, wow, finally an academic who talks about the meaning of life and like questions things and questions the nature of reality. I mean, I would walk out of the classroom being like, oh, everything is empty. And, like the Buddhist teachings, and he stood my world upside down. But I was like, this is what I've been waiting for, to like question, go deeper into the human existence than just, become the best, make a lot of money, buy a lot of stuff, do all the things. It just
Right.
seemed like there's
Right.
gotta
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
more.
Yeah. Yeah. No,
And yeah,
sorry to interrupt. I was going to say I've always felt the same way. But before we get too far away from it, I just wanted to ask you, you know, that disposition of the person who seems free. And you have jokingly said, I think this man was enlightened.
yeah.
I got to ask you, knowing what you know about both neuroscience, psychology, all of these, you know, Western ways of knowing and thinking about what wellness is, what wellness isn't,
Mm.
and knowing what you know about Eastern wisdom, how do you think about what the difference is qualitatively and empirically about the difference between that person who's free versus that person who is constricted? Like, I would love to hear, like, both philosophically and neuroscientifically what you think is going on.
I think it's very difficult for us to understand what it is to be free to
Mhm.
that extent, enlightened. I mean, I do believe I've encountered a few enlightened people in my life. Another one is Guru Dev, who's the person that I've been with, and the other one is Eckhart Tolle. And I remember just when Eckhart Tolle, we were hosting him at Stanford, and I thought, I'll be able to see if he's free when I look in his eyes.
Mm.
I'd experienced a meditation with him. He was guiding a meditation. When he was guiding the meditation, I thought, oh my goodness, he's taking us to the same place that Gurdjieff takes us. And I always think, you can never take anyone where you haven't been before, right? And so I've been I'd been participating in a lot of guided meditations by a lot of great famous meditation teachers, and I'd never experienced something like I did with Gurdjieff.
Wow.
And then later, once when I was with Eckhart Tolle, I was like, oh wait, he's taking me to the same place Gurdjieff takes me to that no one else takes me to. They can take you somewhere else because they're there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I thought, and I always saw in Gurdjieff's eyes, I saw if there's something else. It's hard to explain, and I definitely can't explain it neuroscientifically because I don't know that research has been done. But I remember being like, let me look in Eckhart's eyes after the event because I'll be able to see. And I looked, and he could see, because they have this way of knowing where you're thinking, and he could see that I was looking, and and I was like, okay, yeah, they've got the same thing going on. Michael, I can't explain it. I don't think we know. I don't think we've ever studied this. And I think there aren't that many enlightened people walking around for us to really have that understanding. But it's kind of like when like there's something about them that is completely different,
Yeah.
and that is unattached, that is both very deeply benevolent and at the same time kind of unfathomable.
Hmm.
So it's like this benevolent wisdom, and yet you just feel like there's no one at home.
Wow. Yeah, and I mean, I obviously don't think we can know in any kind of strict terms either. I think it's one of those states, like, the Platonists would call it a noesis. Like, if you I'm not sure how fresh any kind of Platonism is on your mind, but like
I
in
love the cave. I've loved
yeah,
it. I think about it often.
yeah, it's so good, especially when you
Yes.
pair it with the analogy of the divided line, right? Like these four kinds of knowing that Socrates talks about just before the cave, and then you come to find out the cave and the prisoner's journey out of the cave exemplifies these four different states of knowing. And I bring this up because this idea of being there versus talking about it or trying to study it, the noesis, this highest kind of knowing, is exemplified by when the prisoner looks directly at the sun, which again from earlier in the Republic is this idea that the sun is the representative of the truth, like the form of the good. Um, and you can't talk about it, you can't, explain it. You just have to experience it and see it and feel it and be there for yourself. And that's been my, experience too, like in decades of playing in these waters and altered states and trying techniques. It's just like, when you're there. And I mean, what comes to mind for me is I did an ayahuasca retreat in 2019, and it was very, very difficult. Like it was just it was the hardest thing I've ever done in terms of this arena of stuff. And I didn't, it was 5 different sessions, and I didn't know if I was going to make it through. But it was like the community is what kind of kept bringing me back, because you leave the Maloka, and then everybody kind of laughs and talks and cries, and it's just like, such a bond. And then by the next night, you're like, there's no way I'm not going back in there. Um, but then on the third night, when I finally did break through out of all this like dark, shadowy, demonic, for lack of a better term, stuff, I had one of these experiences that was so undeniable that the first thing I did, when I got back to my room, was I had, a little journal with me, and I just wrote over and over again, never doubt that this happened, never doubt that this happened, never doubt that this happened. Because it's one of those things that, just like what you're talking about, you got kids, you got a career, you got all these things that are going to encroach upon your mind and take you out of that reality that is there, that you've experienced, that you've been led into. So it's like, it's almost like when you're in that state, you've got to make sure you make a really strong imprint so that you don't forget, like, this is real, this is
Yeah.
here, I'm in
Yes.
this all the time, even though I'm going to get lost in my own little world. um so yeah, there's just this kind of knowing and being that you just have to do. And that can be kind of frustrating because, like I said before, we're such story-based creatures, especially in the West. We are like these ego story, we're so immersed in our own ego stories that we think that's what reality is. And then we think we can just do some, like, follow a bunch of manifestors on Instagram or like whatever, and like
Oh,
we're going to wake up somehow, but that's not how it works. And I want to ask you more about how it does work, because I know that you eventually stumbled across a breathing technique that was
mhm.
incredibly effective at eliciting this sort of oceanic present feeling. So I'd love to hear that story, and I'd love to
Sure.
hear a little bit about how that's done.
Yeah, thanks for all you shared. I mean, it's interesting because zooming back to when I was in college, I had a car accident
Oh, wow.
that left me and my friend, nobody believed that there were any survivors given how totaled the car was. And
Wow.
yet we were totally totally survived. But what was interesting is that my friend became spiritual from one day to the next. She was like very devout atheist the day before, and then she came out of the car. We both crawled out of the wreck, and she goes, "We have guardian angels." That was the first
Wow.
thing she said, and she completely changed her whole perspective on life after that. So I was like, I guess that's why we had to have the accident. I don't know. But the next day, for 24 hours, we were in a state of complete freedom, completely devoid of stress, completely not even understanding the stress that everyone else was in. We were in a state of freedom that I think, having come so close to death, our mind, for a moment, never doubt that this happened. Never forget this moment, right? Like
Yeah. Yeah.
in that moment, with complete freedom, complete peace, complete joy, complete just compassion. And like that was very, very, very powerful for about 24 hours, maybe 48 hours. And then, anyways, moving forward, when I was in New York during, 9/11 happened, I had just so much anxiety every morning at 8:30. My body would shake before I'd leave my apartment. And I was trying Bikram yoga. I went to Bikram yoga like 4 or 5 times a week. I followed Buddhist monks around whenever they were coming to the Tibet house. I would go hang out there and do whatever. But I just couldn't shake the shakes. Really, it was
Yeah.
really hard. And until I walked into this breathing class at Columbia that some of my colleagues, my classmates had put on, and it was Gurudev's breathing practice called Sky Breath Meditation, Sudarshan Kriya. And I hated it. And I thought, what is this? This is stupid. And I did it. And then at the end of the class, the teachers are like, well, if do this for 40 days. And I said, yeah, I'm going to do it because I don't believe it works. And that's why I'm going to do it. I'm going
Mm.
to prove you wrong. And I for 40 days, I did that practice, and 20 something years later, I've never gone a day without doing it, including on the days I gave birth to my children. It hands down been the most profound thing I've ever learned. I mean, honestly, I was an undergrad at Yale. I did my master's at Columbia. I did my PhD at Stanford. I've gotten a lot of education in great places, and this is the most valuable thing I have learned ever. Um, and I've run studies on it for veterans with trauma, as well as for undergrads with mental health issues here at Yale and other places. And we've seen just how powerful it is at helping with trauma, with anxiety. I mean, the veterans that we've worked with, they basically just, stopped self-medicating with weed and alcohol and just moved on with their lives, and it was as if that nothing had happened ever. So it's very moving. It was very moving also to be able to run those research studies. And yeah, I mean, I don't know what it does,
Mhm.
except that it does definitely heal people from trauma and anxiety. But once there was this geisha, this Tibetan geisha, basically equivalent of a PhD in Buddhism, who asked me, he said to me, I want to learn this practice. I've been to India. The Dalai Lama sends me to Gurudev's ashram when he can't go. And everyone there is just so positive, and I just want to learn to do this. And so I thought, okay. And so I actually I had gone through the training to learn to teach it. Although I don't really teach it much anymore, but I had a little more time before kids. And so I taught him, and I thought, this is weird. I'm teaching someone who knows so much more and has been studying this since he was a kid.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting to hear him talk about what happens, because after he did the practice, he said to me, oh, when we go to the deepest place of meditation, we call it clarity. And it takes 45 minutes to an hour to get there. And he said, this takes you right there. He said, it's
Wow.
the fast track.
Wow.
And I remember meeting him again a few years later, and I was like, did you really say that? He's like, yeah, it's the fast track.
That's
So,
really cool.
yeah, apparently other yogis and stuff sort of argued with Gurudev about, why are you giving this to people? Like, I guess traditionally, you give people alternate nostril breathing and you have them do that for 50 years, after they've
Yeah.
toiled on your land for 50 years, and that's pretty much all they're going to get. And I think they were like, why are you giving people this? And he said, this is what people need right now. And I have to say, I mean, given what's going on the planet and how freaking wild these times are, and how anxious people are, and how much trauma is there at so many levels for so many people, um, I hope more people
Oh
learn
my God.
learn this practice. And
Yeah.
um, if we can heal the trauma in our collective, in our children, and our adults, this world can become a better place.
Oh my God. I know. And it's just so funny because I was just talking to my friend on the podcast a couple of days ago, Alexander Biner, brilliant guy, um, author, tons of consciousness experimentation, really just well spoken, well read guy. And he was used to be a part of this YouTube channel called Rebel Wisdom. And this was
Mhm.
a few years ago. They haven't made a lot of content since. And one of their big missions was to just like discuss and understand the meta crisis and the meaning crisis. And we were talking a couple days ago, and I was just like, oh, isn't it so fucking great now that we solved the meaning crisis and the meta crisis? Because it's only gotten crazier and more novel. And it just seems like it's always getting crazier and more novel. It's just like, just when you think we've reached peak insanity, division, stupidity, it just keeps getting crazier and crazier. And that's why I love the simplicity of something like a breath practice, because it doesn't require you to believe anything. It doesn't
Right.
matter like what political alignment you're a part of, what you think
Yeah.
about this social issue, what you think about that social issue.
Yes.
It helps you just turn off the stories, be in one of these embodied states of knowing and being that we have such a hard time reaching. And I think that's important to say before I ask you this question of like, what is it? How do you do it? Because I know I looked into the gist of it, and a skeptical person could be like, oh, it's just this. It's just you're
Right.
just breathing this for this amount of time and then exhaling for that amount of time. But what you don't understand, and I haven't done this practice, but I've done some breath work in the past. And the way it gets you outside of your stories and your self referencing and your ego and just gets you into these expanded states is incredible. Like and on the note of Bikram yoga, I used to have a yoga teacher. Um, and I will say I'm not nearly as accomplished in Bikram as you must have been. I only did it a few times, but he used to say, "The breath is the king of the mind," and I loved that so much. Because for anybody who's ever done hot yoga, it is hard, especially when you haven't done it a lot, and your breath is like your only friend in there sometimes. Um, so it's profound, deceptively simple, but I want to ask the specific question because I'm sure so many people want to know what is this technique, and what has your experience been like doing it?
Yeah, so I mean, I love what you said about, breathing is accessible to anyone, and it doesn't matter what your belief system. I mean, the veterans that came into our study were like, "We're coming here for the money. This is a hippy dippy, whatever, whatever."
Yeah,
And I was like, "Good. We're paying you to be in the study, and we don't want you to have any biases to begin with."
yeah,
But what is really interesting with veterans too, they're super grounded. They're like, they have a show me attitude,
hmm,
and within minutes, they're like, "Oh, okay, we get it. Like, we get it." Because the thing with the breathing, you can sit there and meditate and feel like, I don't know what's happening or if anything's happening. But with breathing, within 5 minutes, because within 5 minutes, you can calm your nervous system down. Within 2 minutes, you calm your nervous system down if you know how to use the breath properly. And I think that's what's so great. The other thing is, even if you're injured, even if you can't walk, even if you're a wounded veteran, if you're alive, you're breathing. That's pretty much the one guarantee, right? Is that you're breathing if you're alive, no matter
yeah,
how injured you are. And so anyone can do it. And that's what I really love. In terms of the practice, like you said, there's so many breathwork practices out there on YouTube, on other places. And right now it's like everyone's suddenly a master breathwork instructor. It's like the new fad.
right,
And that's great. But different breathing practices are going to have different effects on you. Certain breathing practices were used by the Sikh to go into war and to
mm,
prepare them for that, and then some of the yogis were using different breathing practice to bring you into a state of calm. So it's important to learn it from a proper instructor who really knows. And the sky breath meditation was created by Gurudev, I think something like 40 years ago, and he went into meditation. He was teaching TM at the time with Maharishi, and he went into meditation and he sort of received this practice and started teaching it and saw that this is what people were needing. And he had noticed that people were so stressed, it was very difficult for them to meditate, and that this breathing practice it helped people with their stress so that they could meditate. And in terms of how it's done, I mean, I really recommend going with an instructor who knows what they're doing and how they're
yeah,
teaching. And and that's always my perspective, because I have dabbled with, before I was doing this, I dabbled here and there doing different things, and came out a little bit disturbed when I was
mm,
learning it in an improper way from someone who didn't know. I don't know if you've
yeah,
had that experience, Michael,
yeah.
but now
Not
I'm just like,
exactly, but yeah, no, I've had that with other things, but not breathwork specifically.
no, not with breathwork, but like I can remember a yoga thing and a past life thing, like these things,
Oh
I
yeah,
knew
yeah,
what I was
yeah, yeah, yeah,
doing, and it was very disturbing. And I just feel like we need to just learn from proper instructors, and the instructors are trained by Gurudev. So I just recommend, it's a series of breathing practices, and like you said, you can find the instructions in the papers and whatever, but it's not going to be the same as learning it from an instructor who has learned properly how to teach it. And you can learn it over 3 days on Zoom through the nonprofit Art of Living, or veterans, military family can learn it at no cost through Project Welcome Home Troops, which is so cool.
yeah,
Again, a couple sessions on Zoom and you're done, and then you have this practice at home.
yeah. And you have this like clean line of lineage, which is one of those things that was another language that we've lost in the West, which I think is uh, a partial casualty of losing the language of ritual and creating sacred spaces, being in those sacred spaces, um, which is another way of stepping outside of your ego stories, right? That are where I mean, I don't care what anybody says, what religion they say they're a part of. I think we can all agree that 99% of people in the West worship their own ego and their own, egoic accolades more than they worship any god or whatever religion that they say they're a part of. I know that, like, Joseph Campbell had some amazing quote about how it's toward the end of Hero with a Thousand Faces, where it's something to the effect of, in the West, like, we've been reduced to like monkey religions or something like that, where it's like
Mm,
most people, if not less, go to a church one time a week. They follow a bunch of directions they're given, and then they go about the rest of their life for the other 6 days of the week. And then that's supposed to mean that they're religious? Like that doesn't seem religious as much as it seems like some, I don't know, weird little hobby, But these practices are things that really truly change you from the root. They change your physiology, they change your psychology. I remember reading, though earlier we said we can't know what's going on just through the brain or studies. You know this better than me. There have been studies done on longtime meditators, and their brains change significantly.
yes.
Um, so to me, that's so much more interesting than exoteric religion. How are you changing yourself on the soul and psyche and physiological and neurological levels? That's something that these practices will allow you to do. um, have you ever bumped into Dr. Lisa Miller at all?
I have her books, and I would
Okay.
love to bump into her. Have you interviewed her?
Yes, yeah,
I
she's so wonderful
love
and
her.
fantastic.
Yeah.
This conversation's reminding me a lot of her book, The Awakened Brain, and I know she's one of these people who has looked at, um, what's going on in the brains of these people who not only have meditated for a long time, but they live more in this expanded state that you're talking about. And she looks at it, cross cultural, cross religious boundaries, and has found some really interesting um, commonalities in people's brains and in people's um, psychology. Um, but tell me more about what you found in the study that you did with the breath work. What kinds of changes did you see?
So the first study was with these veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and an active group, and then the control group that didn't receive an intervention. And the active group that went through the intervention, it was about a week long intervention. They learned the breathing, the Sudarshan Kriya. It's called sky breath meditation for short, over a couple of days. And then we measured both their anxiety, depression, before and after. And we also measured their startle response. So it's the extent to which their body startles in response to a loud noise, for example. And for people who don't have severe trauma, those startling noises are annoying. But for if you do, it can be extremely startling. And for example, I mean, I remember one time being in a room with veterans I was presenting to, and somebody knocked the back of his chair against the wall behind him, and the other guy like jumped under the table.
Mm,
Like, it's just it reminds you too much of life and death situations you might have
of
been in
course.
the past.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, so we wanted to see, well, it's people might say their anxiety is lower because they like us, or maybe they would have said their anxiety was lower because they got a massage every week. Like, how do we know if this is real?
Yeah.
And so looking at startle allows us to look at whether it's more real. And what we found was that the more the veterans reported their anxiety diminishing, the less startle response they showed. And the correlation was zero point 0.9, which means a very, very strong relationship between the two. So we can really feel confident about that. And then we also wanted to measure their anxiety 1 month and 1 year later. And we found that the normalization of anxiety levels, so the reduction in anxiety, persisted 1 month and 1 year later, suggesting a permanent shift in their nervous system. Now, most of these veterans did not continue the practice after the class. They were there for their money, they got it, but it had this acute effect of normalizing their nervous system. So when you can think of post-traumatic stress, it's almost like your nervous system is in sympathetic activation, so in that fight or
Mhm.
flight, and can't get out of it, which is why there's problems with sleep, anger, and cognitive ability declines and so forth, because they're not getting the rest they need, and they're constantly in this hyper alert mode, which is extremely taxing on the body. So that was the first study, and there was actually a documentary made about it called Free the Mind, if you wanted, or if
Oh,
anybody was
cool.
interested in seeing that and actually seeing the shift for the veterans. It's really amazing. I mean, many of them were living bunkered up in their basement, smoking weed and self-medicating with alcohol, and could not function. And they stopped using their sleep meds, stopped using their recreational drugs, moved on with their life, got married, got a job, finished school, like all the things that they were not able to do before. So then most recently, we replicated the study at the Palo Alto VA hospital and comparing the sky breath meditation to the standard gold therapy treatment called CPT, cognitive
Mm-hmm.
processing therapy. And the design of the study was such to show that it wasn't, it's called a non-inferiority study. So you want to see that sky is not inferior to the gold standard.
Mm.
And that is indeed what they found, is that it was at least equivalent to the gold therapy standard. But that when you looked at the level of the brain, those who had gone through the sky breath meditation showed improvements in emotion regulation.
Mm.
And so, back to your point about when you're using these yogic techniques that are breathing based, and the sky breath meditation is a very unique technique. It's not something you would learn in a yoga class, but it's from that sort of Vedic system. You're impacting the physiology. And so, for the veterans, a lot of them said, I still remember everything that happened, but I can move on. Whereas
Mm.
prior, it's like they remembered what happened and it was right in front of their face, and they're not able to go into the mall because
Yeah.
it's a crowded place and they're afraid of going in there, even though they know there's no danger there. But their physiology cannot handle them walking into that crowded space because of their memory. But now it's as if, when we watch a scary movie or a bad movie, terrible movie or something, we remember it, but it's not preventing us from moving forward in our life, right? And that's how it should be. A memory should stay in the past. So it's really amazing. And then we've also run a study with Yale undergraduates, and we wanted to put some of these well-being techniques side by side. So one group went through the sky breath meditation, one group went through mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is well-researched a meditation program. One group went through an emotional intelligence class, and then one group went through nothing. And we wanted to see how do they compare, and who, usually you see declines in mental health and well-being over the course of a semester. We wanted to see, can we buffer these students, so they don't go downhill so fast.
Yeah.
And what we found was that by far the group that had the most results was the sky breath meditation. Back to your point, it's not just a cognitive intervention, because even mindfulness meditation is very cognitive. It's all about just being aware, labeling, and so forth,
Yeah.
noticing. But the breathing, it doesn't require you to do a lot of cognitive stuff. But what does happen is that it's almost like there's a regulation happening at the level of the nervous system, not just at the level of trying to change your thoughts, change your life. That whole paradigm that psychology often has, but that is severe, I think is really lacking, because when you have trauma, when you have anxiety, you can change your thoughts all you want, nothing's going to happen. So the breathing seems to have this regulatory effect, that it's physiologically that is physiological, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore probably has that's probably the reason we're seeing so many significant
Yeah.
improvements. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. And, one of the things I was thinking when I was reading your book before is, um, I was thinking about this in the context of you talking about receiving this rigorous, um, Western academic education,
Yes.
and the kind of, and in a lot of ways that implies a sympathetic state of mind, and kind of, and not state of mind, but sympathetic nervous system state, because you're always achieving, onto the next achievement, onto the next
Yes.
achievement. Oh shit, I've got all these achievements, I've got to, you know like, cross off my list, if or these bad things will happen. And then on the other side of that, it completely makes sense that you would be stuck in this kind of soul searching. Well, now that I don't have any achievements, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to be? And I think that takes us back to the point we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation, which is, we don't even understand the stories that we're programming our nervous system and our brains around until we're
Yes.
just living in them. And until you learn the fluencies that allow you to intervene in those processes that seem like they're just these shadowy, nebulous things that are just the way things are, just the way my brain is, or mind is, or life is, or whatever, doing something like a breathing technique, as humble as it may seem, oh, so you're just breathing, you're just exhaling longer than whatever it is. You don't understand till you do it, until you're into it, and then you see the downstream effects Like for personally speaking, I got really obsessed with Wim Hof breathing for a while, and Tumo style breathing, which
Yeah.
actually is probably not putting you into a parasympathetic state because it's a very excitatory kind of
Yeah.
breathing.
Heating,
Oh,
maybe. Yeah.
yes, heating, right.
Mhm.
And but what I find after that is there's this like rebounding effect. So like you get done with a round of this breathing, and for people that don't know, it's essentially almost just like hyperventilating. It's like,
Mhm.
and you just keep doing that, and you feel this tremendous rush of energy, and you feel this tremendous excitement, and sometimes you have these big like somatic releases from doing it. But then when you go into the calmness afterward, it's just like this profound. It's almost like jumping
Mm.
in the water or something. Like it's a big noticeable change.
Mm.
And that's a kind of fluency that you just don't know you have until you've done it over and over and over again. And
Yes.
what I've noticed, and I mean, I haven't been a regular practitioner of that for a long time, but I did find that it eventually changed the way that I natively breathe permanently. And then I started noticing some of the things that you were talking about where it's like, oh, I don't like react to things as much as I used to. I like there's a big like emotional spikes I used to have to certain stimuli. I just don't have those anymore. And at some point I kind of connected the dots, and I'm like, I think it's because of that. I think I slowed my breathing down and deepened my breathing, and then that sort of changed so many other things downstream. So, yeah, this stuff is powerful, and not often, like, the cash value is not often talked about enough, I don't
Mm.
think.
Well, I love how you talk about that, and especially in academia, but therefore in science and therefore in what we're taught,
Yeah.
there's this like, Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Everything
Mhm.
comes from thought. But no, like the thinking again, it takes you into the garage, it does take you into the living room. There's a whole other level of experience that can be had beyond that realm. And what we know from trauma and anxiety and things like that is you cannot think your way out of those things, unfortunately. If it were only that easy, why are people triggered so much by certain things?
Yeah.
So much of that is just trauma or anxiety. And if we don't fit, and if that's something we address physiologically because it's in the body. Like the veteran who told me I got to brace myself for 20 minutes before going into the mall. There's nothing wrong with his brain. Like he knows there's no danger in the mall, but his body has not caught on yet because of
Yeah.
the trauma. And so that's where you really need those physiological approaches. And then they help you heal your psyche also physically, not just mentally, because the two are together. And I think psychology and to a certain extent, our approach to mental health and well-being divides the body and the mind in this very strange way
Right.
when we're actually one. We're one organism, right? And breathing does give us so much sovereignty. It really can when we learn how to use it. And it's also, like you said, so simple and it's accessible. And yeah, my dream would be that every child learns this in school.
Right. Yeah, I was just talking about this with another friend too. Is imagine if before you did any kind of academic learning, you did some sorts of like somatic regulation techniques, or you like
Yes.
learned about, oh, this is what this feeling is called. That's what that feeling is called. And it's crazy that we don't learn this stuff unless we decide to go down mystical paths, or like
Yeah.
learn like start reading psychology or Jung or something that's by most standards considered off the straight and narrow path of like what wisdom is supposed to be, what knowledge is supposed to be. And it's crazy because to me these are drives that are as innate to being a human being. I was going to say as some of the core survival things, but maybe that's just in my experience, where because I just remember from as a child having this intensely curious, questioning disposition that was always like, why are they doing this? Why are they saying that? Why are they going there? Why do they have this job? Like,
Mm.
maybe not everybody is that intense with it, but even if they're not, I think everybody has those things and is encouraged to just spackle over them, right? They're just encouraged to like don't worry about that. Just keep going to work. Keep going to work. Or
Right.
you're having a mental breakdown now. Maybe you need to go to therapy so that you can go back to work. Like that seems to be
That's
the
right.
the dominant way that we think about these things. Like either you're broken or you're functioning, and
Hmm.
that's not right. I mean, I'm just so encouraged that there are people like you out there doing this research that I think will eventually slowly and is like seeping into the zeitgeist where people are realizing this stuff
Yeah.
now, and that there are so many more resources to um, live in this more like, for lack of a better term, awakened, embodied way of being.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's my hope. I really feel like this can help us with the mental health crises going on and so forth.
I'm so glad we could pick this back up because, like I was just saying, we didn't even get to what probably is my favorite part of your new book, which is the whole intuition section. It's like a pretty meaty exploration of, what it is, the science, the things we understand, the things we don't understand. So and you get into some fairly esoteric things that I was pretty excited to see that you got into. So I'm excited to rap about that.
Yeah, no, definitely. Let's do it.
So it is this nebulous thing, right? Like everybody just kind of says it. And the skeptical part of me is always careful around conversations about intuition, because it's like there's a very, in my opinion at least, there's a very thin veneer sometimes between what people call intuition and what people call bias, right? Like, the way this makes me feel, so I don't want to do it. Like I literally just had a comment the other day that I saw on one of my podcasts or something that was to the effect of, why is it that every time I try to learn something, it's so hard? It's just supposed to be about simplicity or something like that. And, clearly that is a very bias heavy, self serving way to look at information and education. So, how do you discern between those two things personally?
I think it's very important to be aware because there's intuition and then there's fear and then there's desire. And all of
Yeah.
those things could show up as a feeling in your body like, oh, I want this. Therefore, my intuition says I should get that, or
Right.
oh, my intuition says not to go out on stage and talk in front of 300 people. Well, actually, maybe that's your fear, right? So I think the first step, if you want, is to really have a strong meditation and self awareness practice so that you can differentiate between fear motivating you or actually a gut feeling.
Hmm.
So, and from a research perspective, you could think of intuition as many different things. On the one hand, it's just very physiological. So let's say we're talking, right? And let's say you're talking to me and I'm angry and I'm pretending not to be angry,
Hmm.
your heart rate increases,
Mm.
and you don't know in your mind, you don't know that I'm angry, but you might have a feeling, and I'm sure everybody can relate to this feeling of sometimes not feeling comfortable around someone, but not understanding why. It's actually very instinctual because animals will do this too. So horses, for example, they're animals of prey. They're very sensitive to the people and around beings around them. And so if, an equine facilitated therapy is when a therapist uses a horse to work with a patient, and they will tell you that if the patient comes up and says something like, "Oh, I'm not scared of that horse," even though they're scared, the horse becomes extremely anxious and
Mm.
like moves around. It's not that the horse understands English, right? But like as soon as the patient says, "Okay, I'm scared of the horse calms down." Why? Because the horse physiologically, we pick up physiologically, just like the horse is instinctual to pick up cues from people around us. And it's very rapid. It's not something that your intellect hasn't caught on yet, which is why sometimes, like, I don't know why I don't feel comfortable around this person. I can't explain it, but I don't, right?
Yeah.
Your heart rate, meanwhile, is going up, your fight or flight is activated. So that's one form of intuition, is that our body is picking up cues from others. We're always looking for safety, feelings of safety, right? That's one of the primordial things we need
Hmm.
and so that's just one example. My friend Kushal was in one of the 9/11 twin towers, and
Yeah. Yeah. I wanted to
I
ask you
told
about
that
this.
story. Yeah, and the guards were like, "Stay in the building, stay in the building," and his instinct, his intuition, or you could call instinct, you can call intuition, gut feeling, told him to run, and he literally ran. It was saved his life by a hair. Like he ran all the way to the boat to New Jersey, and like it had already departed. He literally jumped over the water and hung on and
Wow.
got the last boat out. I mean, what do you call that? It's a very rapid form of perception, cognition. There's many ways that you can think of it. So that's one way, is sort of this
Yeah.
very instinctual, basic, foundational cognitive skill that we share with animals. So that's one way to think about it. But there are more that I'm happy to
Yeah.
share.
Yeah. Let's get into all the different kinds, because there's really interesting examples that you highlight with each one.
Yeah,
I wrote a few things down, but if you want to just riff on it, feel free.
sure. Well, I really like what Albert Einstein has to say. I mean, he was obviously a genius, and he credits many of his ideas to having come to him when he was uh, playing Mozart. Like that's and he has these beautiful quotes where he says, intuition is a and I may be getting a few words wrong here, but he says something like, intuition is a divine gift. The intuitive mind is a sacred gift, and the rational mind is a faithful servant.
Hmm.
We have created a society that honors the servant and has forgotten the gift.
Hmm.
So obviously, logic, reason, important skills that we all need, no doubt about it. But there's another cognitive form, which is intuition, or you can think of it as insight, however you
Hmm.
want to think of it. That's very important. And that's kind of where we get our ideas. So Albert Einstein would listen to Mozart, and then he would come up with his ideas. And I think I spoke the other day to someone who also won the Nobel Prize in economics, and he
Oh
said
well.
he got his idea for the prize that he got from through his meditate. He would meditate, and he would saw the formula, and he wrote it down in a weekend, done, and he got the
Hmm.
prize for it. And what happens is when your brain is in alpha wave mode, which means it's not fully focused, but it's not so relaxed you're about to pass out. It's like in that in between state, which you could think of as a meditative state of mind. That is when we know from neuroscience that we're most likely going to get our aha moments, like those moments where you're like, oh, I know what I'm going to do. How I'm going to solve that problem.
Yeah.
You can think of it as your brain in active problem solving mode in the background while you're, doing something more relaxing, or you could think of it as receptivity to a creative source. I mean, however you want to think about it, we know that this is what happens in the brain, and everyone can relate to this, because whenever I ask audiences, when do you get your creative insights? When do you get your solutions to the problems you're working on? Inevitably, people will be like, well, when I'm in the shower or walking my dog or right before bed or, in the morning when everything's still quiet. It's in those modes when your brain is in alpha wave mode. And that's another reason that meditation is so, so important to have those moments. I mean, I remember once when we were out of childcare overnight, and the next day I needed someone to take care of my kids. I had to work, my husband had to work. And I sat down to meditate, and I was like, I have no idea what I'm going to do. And I meditated, and just as I was done and I was about to get up, all of a sudden it hit me. Like I got this insight. It was like, oh, so-and-so's mom. And I called her, and she was looking for another job, and she started the next day. I mean, it was crazy.
That's crazy.
But so anyway, that's a second sort of form. And the military actually has been looking at intuition for many decades, and it was made fun of in a movie called Men Who Stare at Goats.
Yes. I wanted to talk to you about this.
Yeah, and even though it was made fun of in that movie, and that particular research program was closed, it has been opened again. I know this because I spoke to a military scientist, but no one, it's top secret. Like no one on the actual team talked to me, but I know the military scientist who's saying this is going on because my colleagues are all doing it, but they won't talk to me either. It's like a top secret program. But there were so many soldiers coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan who had expressed that, they had saved their life or someone else's life because they just felt like, I just shouldn't go down that road, And what do you call that? And this military scientist that I interviewed, he said that what the research showed is that the soldiers were always more than 50% accurate when doing these sort of intuition exercises, showing that it was more than chance. Anyway, that research is ongoing because the military is always trying to figure out how to maximize human performance. Right. But one of the training programs that the Marine Corps uses is called combat hunter training. And I interviewed a Marine for this who'd gone through it. And that one is an exercise of complete awareness. So again, being able to bring your mind fully in the present moment and to be aware of it,
Mm.
any way in which your environment is showing a deviation from the norm. So it's a form of complete awareness. And like he would say like, oh, if we walk by a playground that was usually full of kids and all suddenly it was empty, that would be a deviation from the norm. Or if
Right.
we're with a bunch of Afghani soldiers and, they're relaxed, smoking cigarettes and laughing and talking, everything's fine. But if suddenly they start to look tense, and they've got their hands on their weapon, that's a sign something's off. And
Yep.
they would observe. It's keen observation. So it's so interesting, right? You can think of it in many different ways. On the one hand, complete awareness on the outside, complete awareness and observation. On the other hand, it can be this very physiological process, and on the other hand, it can be this process of rest where your brain goes into alpha wave mode and is in this more relaxed mode, and it's sort of receptive, right? So there are many ways that we can think of it, and then there may be
Right.
more. But what we do know is that we don't know all the faculties that our brain has. We know very little about the brain, even though we can talk about it. What we know, there's a lot we don't know.
Yeah.
And indigenous communities traditionally had intuition very much as a part of their culture for survival. And we can think of it as an instinct meant to save our lives and guide us away from danger and towards safety, but also as this great tool for innovation and
Mm-hmm.
innovative insight. And you think about kids, they are, as long as they're safe, they are often in this mode, which is completely present, very aware, more aware than adults about what's going on, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I was with my kid in the grocery store the other day. He's like, "What's that music?" And I was like, "I hadn't even registered music was on." Like they're so aware because they're so present. At the same time, if they're feeling safe, they're in an alpha wave state. They're
Mm-hmm.
extremely creative. My kids are constantly pulling cardboard out of the trash. Why are you throwing this away? And like building something with it, and also physiologic, they're very embodied, they're in their body, right? As adults, we can be completely disembodied up in our head and our worries and our stresses, completely not in the present moment, not in touch with our body, not in touch with the environment, and embroiled in thoughts, feelings, ideas,
Yeah.
entertainment, whatever, substances, and the list goes on. But we have this sort of this innate technology. Our body is such a sophisticated, probably the most sophisticated device that we have is our body, with its ability to be receptive, to be perceptive. And that is something that we can also train. So there's a program in India that stems out of India. It was created by Gurudev Sri Sri Ravi Shankar. Do you know him?
You brought him up last time.
I had
Yeah.
him up last time. Yeah,
Yeah.
he's amazing. You should meet him. I mean, you would love him. But
Oh yeah. Yeah.
in any case, yeah, he created this program, and by which children are trained to become more intuitive. It's only for up to 18 years old, and he says it's also because children are more or less encumbered by concepts and
Hmm.
beliefs and how things should be and how things are. In any case, it's really moving because some of these practices are then taught in schools for the blind, and you see these kids that are blind and they're able to see color. They're able to read text. I've seen this myself because I'm lucky. I'm privileged to mentor this girl who's gone through this program her whole life. And I've seen her putting on a blindfold and reading from a book, I mean, line by line.
Wow.
So there's so many things our brain is not yet, we have not yet discovered about the brain and our faculties and our abilities
Yeah.
to perceive. Yeah.
Yeah, there's so many things. Like I had trouble not interjecting a couple times.
Yeah.
There's so
You
many
did
things I
good.
want to dig further into. I want to know more about that. What you saw. I want to go back into the remote viewing conversation a little bit because that's just such a fascinating one. And also brainwaves and awareness. Like these are all things I would love to explore with you a little bit more. But before we get too far away from it, here I am thinking like, oh, that might sound controversial to talk about, blindfolded children or blind children reading, but I'm going back into the most, at least conventionally woo thing by bringing up the conversation about remote viewing. But as
Yeah.
you pointed out, this is something that really went on. The most well-known project that was classified at some point was Project Stargate, but there were all these other names that it went by. And during the Cold War, this is something that we now know is real from declassified documents, that there were psychic spies on both sides, like the Soviet side and the American side, trying to look into military facilities, trying to do all these different things with these abilities. You hear anecdotally that this stuff must still be going on, and then I've just heard from you now from like a seemingly direct source that it's still going on. Um, and I mean, what do you think when you hear that, as somebody who knows so much about psychology, knows so much about the brain, and then is confronted with an idea like, and you can also have this non-local perception, like what like are you, do you feel divided as like a scientist and a curious person, or how do you think about this?
I don't at this point. I mean, I've just seen it too much. I've seen it with my bare eyes.
Yeah.
My child actually went through the program, and he is tells me things that are, it just, he could not have known. And I just feel like, I just at this point think that sometimes the biases of science are that something doesn't work and therefore it's not properly researched. So the difference between a skeptical scientist and a cynical skeptic, a cynical scientist be like, that's not possible, so those and research it. Skeptical scientist is like, that's not possible, but I'll research it, And I really think
Big difference.
a big difference. And I think it's interesting because scientists have their biases. And I think we see that. We see that all the time. But because they have their biases in their paradigm, they will not look outside of it. Like even when I was studying emotion regulation and I wanted to study breathing, which I think I talked about last time, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, people were like, oh, God, that's an old-fashioned way of thinking about regulating emotions. I'm like, old-fashioned? Like, dude, this works? This is not old-fashioned. This is next level, And then we did the research, and now everybody is suddenly a breathwork master, and there's like breathwork research happening in major institutions all around the US and the world. So, and same with meditation, So I really think intuition is going to be the next big thing that we research, and it's happening. And it's exciting too. I think it really does give people their sovereignty. It can really, how many people feel lost, feel disconnected from themselves, don't know their own purpose in life, don't know, day to day why they're doing what they're doing, are so out of tune with themselves. And, that's why I talk about meditation a lot, because I think it really can put you back in touch with yourself. And then intuition is just another way of being in touch with yourself, right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah. Just to clarify something. So you mentioned that your child went through the training. I just don't want people to think, not the Project Stargate training,
no,
but the training that you were talking about before, to train this
kids training,
innate intuitive faculty that we have that allows people to do things that, I mean, most people would say is like ESP or a superpower or something that is like extra sensory or using some kind of faculty, at least, that we don't understand, right? So can you talk a little bit more about this training they did, the kind of things they were able to do from the training? I know in the book you said that you saw some kids having these almost like, I don't know if you've seen Stranger Things, but almost like the Stranger Things level of being able to color pictures that where they're not able to see.
Yeah.
Please share more about that. Yeah.
I walked into there's a day the second day you walk in as a parent, and you can just walk around the room. The kids are blindfolded doing their activities, and I saw this tiny little kiddo, maybe 5 years old, tiny little guy, and he was supposed to color in this picture of like a mouse or something. And next to him was a picture of the mouse with fully colored, and he was supposed to replicate, and he was replicating, but he was going into the corners like so in detail, like he could see. I mean, it was really, I had tears streaming down my face, I think, because of the shock, the cognitive dissonance of just, oh, wow, like this is possible. Yeah. But since then, I've seen it so much, especially with the 16, 17, 18-year-olds who are like finding missing people and things like that. It's just, and I know these, I've seen it, and I've seen with my own eyes. So there's a point also when you see things enough, then you're just like, oh, okay, that's a thing. It doesn't make it weird anymore. There's a documentary film being made about this, by the way, and I don't know what it's called, but Michael Collins is making it. It's like my son. He's like, if he sees, these 16, 17-year-olds reading with blindfold, he doesn't even flinch. He's like, okay, yeah, this is something that we can do. As adults, we're so caught up in our limited perception of what is possible and what is not. But truth is, like, we don't even know who we are. We don't know why we're here. We don't know how we're built. We don't know what our capacity is. We don't know any of those things. We can pretend we know, but we don't really know.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you think, I know you said that in this particular program, they're limiting it to children, but I have to think that you yourself must be curious. Like, is there a way that any people of all ages can do this? Is there like a period where you just hit this point where I don't know, like maybe you're so wrapped up in your default mode network and your identity and your ego and all these things that you just can't, it's just harder to get underneath that? Like, what are some, because I mean, I'm sure you must wonder yourself, like, how can I kind of train these abilities up myself? Have you tried to do that?
Um, I mean, the program is just for kids, so I don't do the exercises myself. But and it's really cute. At the end of the program, the kids do a vow. They're like, I will not crack passcodes. I will not predict the stock market. I will not, um, pick up credit card numbers. Blah blah
Yeah.
blah. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's really cute. I think as adults, I mean, I honestly, I think meditation helps you be more intuitive. I certainly know that in the moments when I've really needed them, I have had strong intuitions kick in. And I think one way to know that it actually is an intuition is because it goes against everything that you could logically think. It doesn't make any logical sense. And that's always where I'm like, why am I having this thought when it doesn't make logical sense?
Yeah.
And when it's that different from what my logic would then, and it's a very pressing feeling like you got to do this. Like I had a situation like that with someone and I kept having the feeling I needed to fire them.
Hmm.
And it kept coming. And I was like, how can I fire this person? I love this person. Like this person's amazing. And then I ignored it. And it came 2 months back, came back harder. And I was like, this doesn't make any sense. We have this long-term working relationship together and this person is amazing. And then it came again really hard 2 months later. And it was like, I couldn't even contain it. I was like, you're fired. Like I just fired the person. I was like, am I nuts? And then later I realized that person was doing some really shifty business in the background, terrible things. And
Hmm.
I had no idea. And those kind of moments, you're like, okay, like there's a part of me that is picking up information that I didn't know. But in the moment, I was like, I'm nuts. I'm certifiably nuts. Like, why did I just do this?
Yeah.
It's like for my book Sovereign, I got 3 different offers, and one was like a top offer by a top company paying top dollar. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then there were 2 other offers. And my intuition kept going with the lowest offer. I
Wow.
mean, I thought it was nuts. My poor husband and agent were like, really? You're gonna, and I was like, am I crazy? Like, what's happening? And I was like, I can't, they give you like 12 hours to make a decision. So I was like, okay, I'm going with that in my gut. But I was like, I'm nuts. I guess I'm nuts. I don't know. And then I find out that top company, the editor that was gonna buy my manuscript, like 1 month later left and had another offer somewhere else. And
Oh,
if your
wow.
editor leaves, then you could just be, who knows what'll happen to you or your book, or even the contract will even be signed, or if you'll be just sort of abandoned, you'll be like contract signed, but you're abandoned, you have no support. The editor is
Wow.
your biggest cheerleader. Anyway, just some personal experiences, but I think we've all had them, we've
Mm-hmm.
all had them, like been in a relationship and been like, I really shouldn't be in this relationship. Or maybe we dragged it on for too long. It's possible, but I think
Yeah.
we all know what it's like. I think especially when it's a big life thing, then we do get those feelings. If we're paying attention, if we're not numbing out on substances or overworking or and numbing out our life. Like if you're a little bit aware, if you try to work on that, if you meditate or spend a little bit of time getting in touch with yourself, you do notice them.
I completely agree. I'm tempted to launch into some of my own personal anecdotes, but
Yeah.
I will actually ignore that instinct though, because I do want to take advantage of the time that we have. But one thing I can't help but bring up here, because I think it's a really interesting connection, is this relationship between alpha brain waves, which, as you point out, are slower moving brain waves, but they're still, a brainwave associated with like awareness. Like when you're out in the world, you're in like a beta state. Correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but then as you point out, alpha is more associated with meditation. I've heard it's associated with flow states. And what's really interesting is I brought up Dr. Lisa Miller to you last time, and there's some kind of alpha wave that comes off the back of the brain that she has researched that she says is the same frequency as like the Schumann resonance of Schumann resonance of the Earth itself. So she says that people like, you know, her kind of version of what you talk about, which I think is very similar to this sovereignty idea in some ways, is the idea of an awakened brain. And she says that these awakened brains, quote unquote, of people of all different spiritual persuasions who live these really, you know, embodied lives, spiritually driven lives, they all have this same brainwave feature. And it's really interesting to think about, like, what could the relationship maybe be between being in that kind of a state and then, as she's pointed out, like also resonating with the frequency of the earth itself. Like, I mean, again, I guess I'm going out there with this one and totally speculating, but it almost seems like your consciousness is somehow entangling with some kind of higher, more innate earthly consciousness or something, and maybe that's where this higher kind of awareness is coming from. Like you're like tapping into the anima mundi or something like that, or I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I write in my book, I devote a whole like chapter to our connection with nature and with,
Hmm.
you know, we stem from nature. Like we're born 5, 6, 7 pounds. Like our whole weight we gained from nature, right? We are made up of the earth. And yet we can live so disconnected, and we live completely disconnected lives oftentimes from that. And then the animal world, unless they're domesticated, are very much in tune with nature and know when a storm is coming and know when an earthquake is coming. And there's so much knowledge that they have that we don't have, and they can see things we can't see, and they can hear things we can't hear, and they can smell things we can't smell. And, you know, I really feel like if we can reconnect with ourselves and with the natural rhythm of the earth, of the planet, as opposed to being constantly in go, 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 overstimulated, over caffeinated, over everything, you know,
Hmm.
eating junk food. I mean, eating like things that aren't even food, you know?
Yeah,
The other day
yeah,
someone was saying there's no junk food. There's just junk and there's food. Like it's literally. But anyways, the more in tune we can become with ourselves and with nature, it makes absolute sense to me that we would be more in tune with things that that other, you know, other creatures are in tune with that we aren't, because we've been so disconnected. And I think part of a lot of sovereignty is reconnecting with ourselves and with the planet. You know, there's such a fascination with alien worlds and extraterrestrials, but you know, we fail to recognize that we are ourselves have become extraterrestrial. We live
that's
on
true.
this planet, but we're not in tune with it. We're living on it like, you know, tourists who just landed somewhere and are acting
Yeah,
obnoxious. We're not at all in tune. And I think the more in tune we become, the more everything expands. Our happiness expands, our awareness expands, our intuition expands, our compassion expands, our wisdom expands, our power expands,
hmm,
you know.
yeah, yeah. And I think that I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seemed like you were saying before that meditation is one of the most important ways to regain some level of access to this sense and to intuition. And it is really interesting. And I heard you bring up Dr. Jonathan Schooler in the book briefly. I talked to him years ago, and I remember at the time it was just like I was so excited to get that interview because, as you point out in the book, there is such a shortage of real science being done on all this stuff, and he's one of the few people at like a legitimate, you know, academic institution who's been courageous enough to do this kind of research on
Yes.
like epiphanies and um what else does there's another thing he does that I'm struggling to come up with, but it's in this whole arena
Mind
of
wandering.
say that again.
Mind wandering. Yeah, I mean, we gain our insights when our mind is wandering. And we live in a time where we either over prioritize work, so we're constantly focused, and in our leisure time, we're on our screens, focused. We are robbing ourselves of our innate innovative genius and ability to come up with novel insights. And if there was a time on the planet when we need novel insights more than ever, it's right now. And we're doing the same with our children. Here, take a screen.
Yeah.
Robbing them of their innovative genius and potential. And so we need, and either because we live in this, especially in the US, in this culture where we feel like we always have to be productive, always focused, or when we're entertaining ourselves or distracting ourselves because we feel so uncomfortable being alone with our thoughts, which is the case for many people, right? Numbing, we're focused again. And so, and that, of course, it's nobody's fault. Like, people would rather give themselves electric shocks than sit alone with their thoughts in a room. You know that, right? There's a research study.
I've heard that. That's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, there are many, many reasons for that. Trauma and many things but we've also gotten addicted to being in this busy state, in this focused state, in this entertained state, in this distracted state, because being alone with our thoughts has become so foreign. It's become so foreign to be connected to yourself. That, if you think about it, is absolutely insane. It's insanity.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like we need to retrain ourselves to just be, and yet when you can retrain yourself to that, and if you can reconnect with that, it's the most beautiful state in the world. The most beautiful state. But it's so interesting how far we've come from that, especially in the US, So that's something I think that, when people become more connected, then they automatically become more connected with themselves, more aware, more intuitive, everything starts to make more sense. And it's a little bit of a journey. If you're used to distracting yourself or substancing yourself or whatever, overworking or whatever the many ways you might have chosen to fill your time.
In the last few minutes we have here, if you could share what you think some of the most powerful ways to do that are. Is it I mean, you've said meditation. Is there a specific kind of meditation? Is it? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. When I first started meditating, trying to meditate, it was mindfulness, and I was really anxious, and it was really hard to sit there. And plus, mindfulness is becoming aware of your thoughts, but you're kind of still focused, in that sense. And I personally already live a very focused life because I'm an academic and I do research and I write. And so I've benefited from a meditation that does not involve that intense focus. And so, I think I talked last time that I do the sky breath meditation every day, the breathing, that every day. But then I like a mantra-based meditation that allows me to be in a more unfocused place, or I do a guided meditation with my teacher at Gurudev. There's an app called Sattva that I use every day. But I really feel like find the shoe that fits for you, sometimes people are like, well, when I exercise, I'm like, yes, when you exercise, your mind can go in alpha wave mode too. But there's something about sitting still that brings another level of awareness.
Yeah.
And I think we live in a time that's so crazy active that it's revolutionary to sit still and do nothing, but it's also incredibly important as a counterbalance. Other things I recommend are going out into nature without your cell phone, without anything, and just being. And that might be easier as a first step for people. Like, okay, I'm going to be in nature. There's things to look at, there's things to smell, there's things to experience. But that itself is also extremely settling. And, research shows it decreases your anxiety, your depression, increases your creativity by 50%. No surprise, given what we've just talked about.
Yeah.
Increases your well-being. Even increases, benefits your relationships with other people. Just being in nature benefits your relationships with other people because it has such a profoundly harmonizing, I think, effect on us. So, and I think the third thing I would say is, try to be of service in our lives in whatever way we can. You don't have to go feed orphans in Somalia. You can just have that intention. Like, today I want to go, I'd love to uplift every person I talk to, whether it's the barista at Starbucks, where I share a joke with or a compliment, or my colleague. Like, let every interaction be one, a mutually uplifting one. And if not every single one, let those little micro moments in which I connect with another human be one in which I leave the other person better than they found them.
Yes, this is all noble medicinal stuff. I once again wish we had longer, but I'm really grateful for your
No,
time.
Michael.
Thank you for hanging out. And yeah, I'll share the book with everybody. Let me know if there's anything else, or if you want to mention anything now, feel free.
Yeah, so I have a website that goes with the book called iamsov.com, iamsov.com, and I have some extra tools on there, and I'm going to be offering a course on there. So
Lovely. All right. Well, thank you again.
thank you, Michael.